Hello, welcome to the Healthcare Facilities Network. I'm your host, Peter Martin, president of Gosselin Martin Associates. Today's presentation is called Communication in Crisis, Lessons from the Battle of Gettysburg. And as always, of course, our lessons from the Battle of Gettysburg will be slanted more towards the lessons targeted towards healthcare facilities management, because of course, healthcare facilities management is the focus of the Healthcare Facilities Network. So if you don't know, Healthcare Facilities Network very quickly is focused exclusively on the discipline of healthcare facilities management, shows and playlists that speak to the unique world of healthcare facilities. And one of the categories on our YouTube channel is called History's Facilities Managers. That's where this particular piece will be found, in History's Facility Managers. As I've told you a number of times, I love American history. I love history in general. And I think we can learn, and this isn't, just me speaking, we can learn a lot from our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And one of the pieces of history that I'm particularly fond of and love reading about and learning about, and I think I've seen that there's been over 30,000 books written just about the Battle of Gettysburg. So forget the Civil War, just relative to Gettysburg, there's been more than 30,000 books written. So this piece goes under the Healthcare Facilities Management History section. Why did we pick Gettysburg? Well, I think there's a couple of interesting things about it. Gettysburg relative to today's environment and communicating. And I want to pick just three of them because we could lose ourselves in this battle. There are college seminars, college courses, books. So where do you draw the line? Well, what I tried to do is pick three particular pieces of communication that played a pivotal role in the outcome of this battle. And those three particular pieces were, on day one, Lee's use of the words if practicable, which is a difficult word for me to say. On day two, on the Union side, General Meade held a council of war, or what we might call meetings. That was very pivotal. And on day three, the final day of the battle, there were two examples on both the Union side and the Confederate side of collaboration and decision-making that again played a key part in the outcome. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll do a little bonus because there were three lessons following the war: letters, brevity, and not settling, that we will look at. So those are the areas that we will discuss in this class. So just for those of you who may not know, Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd. And as I said, this will not be a review of Gettysburg. There are plenty of places that you can do that. But what we will do is use Gettysburg as a forum to kind of go into healthcare facilities management and the environment of today that you're managing in, or perhaps that you are you're an employee in. But briefly, the Battle of Gettysburg was fought July 1st through 3rd in 1863. The Army of Northern Virginia, or the Confederates, they moved north against the Army of the Potomac, or the Union. It's an invasion force, so you can imagine the fear as that large army moves to the north. The Union Army streams out of the south, streams out of Virginia to try to cut off the Confederate Army between Pennsylvania, where they are, and Washington, D.C. They meet in the small crossroads town of Gettysburg. I know that, commonly we were probably taught when we were kids. I know that it was mentioned to us that it was fought over shoes, and the Confederates needed shoes, and there was a shoe factory in Gettysburg. Well, battle was not shoe related. It was just a crossroads town, and this is where the armies met. It was the pivotal battle of the Civil War. The North won the battle, and from that point forward, it was a matter of when the war would end. It would go on for another 2 years, but the victory at Gettysburg was kind of a pivotal turning point. Now, they may not have known that at the time, but we know that now. So that's a little look at what the battle was. A little bit of backstory about Gettysburg, May and June 1863, because the backstory, even like in our facilities today, the backstory always influences what is going on today. So let's look at the Army of Northern Virginia first. Their confidence is high. Their confidence is very high. They had just defeated the Union Army in a place called Chancellorsville in Virginia in May of 1863. They have about 75,000 men. They're in high spirits, though they don't have a lot of supplies. They don't have a lot of food, which they will get in Pennsylvania. You got to remember, at the time when they fought the Battle of Virginia, that land had been scarred by the Battle of War. And so as the Confederate Army moves north, they found bountiful food and agriculture of Pennsylvania. A key point that occurred at Chancellorsville, which was a route of the North, a late route of the North by the South, was the death of Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was one of Lee's trusted generals, along with James Longstreet. And the death of Jackson, think of it as maybe somebody leaving your staff, a key and trusted individual. The death of Jackson would certainly come into play in the coming Battle of Gettysburg. But on whole, the Army in Northern Virginia is in really good spirits. They're aligned. Lee is their leader. There's confidence, and there was always confidence in Lee on the southern side. But there's confidence, and on the northern side, they were like, how are we going to beat this guy? So high spirits, high confidence for the Army of Northern Virginia as they move north in June of 1863 into Pennsylvania. Now, the Army of the Potomac may be similar to some of your organizations these days. They had management problems. If you go back to Chancellorsville, again, the Battle of Chancellorsville, which happened right before Gettysburg in 1863, the commander is a guy by the name of General Joseph Hooker, one of my Massachusetts, a Massachusetts native. The name Hooker, similar to the shoes, they've said that Hooker and the concept of hookers that we know today originated by Hooker, by Joseph Hooker, because there are many prostitutes around the northern camp, but I've not been able to confirm. And the term hooker was around before Joseph Hooker in 1863, but it seems as though the term was elevated after following Hooker's command, because it was known, Hooker's command was known, booze, ladies, and so it was kind of untawdry. But the general who was leading the Union Army was a gentleman by the name of Henry Halleck, and Halleck, again, they called him Mr. Brains or something similar. And Halleck, probably similar maybe to some of your managers, he wasn't a very pleasant man. He could dabble in affairs, so he's a very difficult man to work for. And their relationship was titled by lack of communication, which is very important, right? It would be like a director of facilities management and a vice president who can't communicate. Think of that for Halleck and Hooker. And when they did communicate, it was frequently contentious. And so on the Union side, coming out of, moving into Gettysburg, it was marred by relationship issues. And Hooker was more focused on dealing with the politics of DC as opposed to invasion force moving north. President Lincoln, again, he's not the Lincoln that we know at this point of 1863. He's not the Lincoln of today. Lincoln is facing a lot of criticism. He's still looking for his general. General Grant is out in the Western theater of the war, so Grant hasn't arrived on the scene yet in the North. And so Lee is seen as invincible. And so on the Northern side, it's very similar probably to the dysfunction that some organizations face today, really from top to bottom. Maybe not so much Lincoln, but from Halleck on down. And so imagine that you are Lincoln, or you are a Northern citizen, and obviously the communication that we have today didn't exist back then, but you weren't feeling real good. And so on June 28th, which is 2 days before the battle, Meade assumes command. So imagine you are taking over a Joint Commission survey on the day that it occurs, and elevate that by 100 because you are responsible for the fate of your country. That's what happens with Meade, is he assumes command. Right about 3 o'clock in the morning on that day, Meade is awoken. You are in charge. And so the first thing that Meade is faced with, first order, is you got to get north, got to get the army continuing north. Now, what was very interesting is that, and if you go back, this is a great book to read, Command and Communication Frictions at Gettysburg. I have an extra one if anybody wants it. Let me know and I will send it to you for free. But it talks about the command structure and the communication structure at that battle. And I think you'd shake your head if you read it today, thinking what it was like back then. But Meade had no time to bring in his own commander. So he's left with Hooker's complete command structure. And they weren't necessarily pleased with Meade's elevation. So Meade is taking over. You are a director, you are a vice president, and this is the first battle you face. You need to save your country. So Meade goes from 13,000 to 100,000 people. He's got to come north. And the interesting thing, and you can see, and this is probably a little bit of a insight into Hooker's soul, if you look at the very bottom, he gave Meade no intention of any plan he was considering or views that he held. So it's a pretty tough environment to take over in. You're essentially blind, other than knowing you got to go to the north. So that's the situation that existed prior to the battle. We look at day one, Army of Northern Virginia. We'll just focus on the communication issues. I think that, day one for the Battle of Gettysburg, and maybe it's because of portrayal in the movie Gettysburg, I think that often day one is probably overlooked. An incredibly bloody day, an incredibly violent day that occurred. We won't go into all of the detail about day one, which was a southern victory at the end of the day. Although the North would hold the high ground, the South did win the day. But what we want to focus on, General Richard Ewell was the general who took over for Stonewall Jackson. General Ewell was given an order late in the day. So late in the day, after the Confederates had already pushed the Northern forces through the town of Gettysburg, had them on the run, and the North retired to the high ground. The North was able to get the high ground, which would prove pivotal in the next 2 days. But late in the day, late in that afternoon, Lee told General Ewell, he instructed Ewell to carry the hill occupied by the enemy if he found it practicable, but to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of other divisions of the army. Those 4 words, if he found it practicable, would be the cause of arguments that continue to today, of books that are written to today, of people speaking poorly of General Ewell, and you find people on both sides, and we are not here to engage in that controversy, because the impact of Ewell's decision to not find it practicable, meaning he did not take the high ground, that would impact the next 2 days significantly. But what I want to do is, again, just focus on that word, if practicable. And here is a view of that area today, of Gettysburg. It's a beautiful battlefield if you ever go down there. I haven't been down there in some time now, and I got to get back, but it's quite peaceful, ironically enough, today. But if you're a manager using terms such as if practicable, there's a good deal of ambiguity in those words, and it's not clear direction. And that also comes into the, what if Stonewall Jackson was alive at Gettysburg? So again, Lee frequently used discretionary orders. If you read anything about him, he was a Southern gentleman of the time, and he was not always direct in his orders. Now, this came to bite him at Gettysburg. If Stonewall Jackson was alive, and again, we've talked about Lee's other corps commander, James Longstreet, and we'll get to him in a bit. If Stonewall Jackson were alive, he probably would have found it practicable. But Stonewall Jackson was also an aggressive general, and he was familiar with Lee. And I think what Lee, and again, we're not talking about the battle. We're not talking about implications on battle. We're talking about implications on management and leadership. Lee's direct style, especially for Ewell, and Ewell was considered to be a very strong corps commander. He had a peg leg. He had lost part of his leg in a previous battle, and so it wasn't like Ewell was a shrinking violet at all. But stylistically, Ewell is new to that approach. And Lee's order, if practicable, not necessarily the most direct order. And so we as managers need to make sure that our orders, that what we're telling our employees are direct if we need it to be direct. I think the other thing about Ewell, he had really big shoes to fill. Think about, we're dealing with a lot of employee turnover. And I guess I would just say one thing. we're in 2023, they're in 1863. So we can Monday morning quarterback. And so everything that we say in this presentation is set through the prism of what we know they didn't know. And stylistically, I wonder would the word collaboration have even existed in 1863 relative to how we work with people today. And it's a different topic, but so I understand 2023 is in 1863. But I think one of the things, if we look at Ewell, imagine Ewell, Stonewall Jackson was famous. Stonewall Jackson was killed in that battle. So Stonewall Jackson is automatically an icon, and Ewell's got big shoes to fill. And I think Lee, his style, he didn't allow for that. And I think that he didn't necessarily know his audience and his team on July 1st, 1863. But again, Lee was very consistent. That is how he managed throughout. But that lost continuity. And as we lose people in our facilities, that continuity, it can get interrupted pretty easily. And lingo, now, Lee wasn't using lingo, but in the facilities management world, in the planning, design, construction world, in the compliance world, our facilities lingo is prevalent. And so let's watch our lingo. Not that if practicable was lingo, but it is words we used. I remember when I started working in construction, there were many words that I didn't know. So I would always sit there in meetings with a notebook, and any words that I heard from people, I would always write them down. And I had a huge list, and I would always go to a dictionary, or I would talk to somebody, or I would go online afterwards, try to learn the lingo, because I understood it was lingo was a weakness for me. But we as managers and we as directors need to minimize the use of lingo and give clear direction. And on July 1st, 1863, even though the Southern Army won the day, those events that occurred late in the day would influence the coming 2 days. E.P. Alexander, if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, or if you've read anything about Gettysburg, Alexander is the colonel on day 3 who's in charge of the barrage. But I thought he writes this after the war. The words, if practicable, are always of such doubtful interpretation. And that's very true. That's very true. So let's use clear, concise words. A little bit of a plug right here. If you're not subscribed to High Reliability, I would ask you to do so. It's a podcast that we create here at Gosselin Martin Associates. It's focused on just the world of healthcare facilities management. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Google. So if you don't do it already, download and subscribe to the High Reliability podcast. Now let's move to day 2. Let's look at the Union side on day 2. We'll look a little at the Confederate side a little bit later, but day 2 again is the battle in and of itself each day could be its own book and movie, as is so often found in battle. But so here let's catch up again with General Meade. General Meade is obviously, he catches the Confederates. He gets his forces between Gettysburg and Washington, D.C. So Gettysburg is up here to the north, D.C. is down here to the south. They catch him in the middle. So on July 2nd, so Meade would call 3 councils of war during the Gettysburg battle period. The battle was the 1st through 3rd. His first council of war during the battle was on the night of July 2nd. So on the day of July 2nd, man, the battle raged back and forth, death, killing, maiming, just again, another brutal, brutal day. Probably a draw at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, the Union held the high ground. And if you had the high ground in the Civil War, then you were doing well. So the Union held the high ground. And at the end of that day, Meade, it's really the first time that he has an opportunity to sit with those commanders of the Union Army, and there's 12 of them. And so here's Meade. He's taken over on July 28th. He's run into the North, and now he finally has time to have that team meeting. Typically when you come in on that first day, you're probably having that team meeting, but Meade didn't have the opportunity to do that until day 2. And if you're keeping score at home, it's probably South 1, but the Union has come to tie that up. And so they know that day 3 is going to be a pivotal battle. And at that point on July 2nd, Meade did a lot of listening at this meeting. He listened a lot and do a lot of, and Meade, if you look, there's a lot of books on Meade. This is one I like. It's called Meade of Gettysburg. Very interesting gentleman. He's an engineer. And so, he built lighthouses and probably a background similar to many of the people working in healthcare facilities management. He was a true engineer, and his lighthouse building, you can look up on that both before the war, was pretty legendary. And so I think that, Meade, I've always thought, and if you read the books about his personality and such, I've always kind of considered him probably like a lot of directors of FMs in hospital, and that he's very skilled on the engineering side. The soft skill part of it can be a little more difficult for him. But on that night, what Meade wanted to know in a little farmhouse in the town of Gettysburg, he wanted to know of his men, do we stay or do we fight? He knows what they've been through, and it was unanimous that they wanted to stay and fight. Now, we will come back to this meeting on July 2nd because it's, Washington, D.C., it's been political. It's always been political. We'll see how it was political in 1863 with Meade, but file this meeting of July 2nd away, because it's going to come back and they're going to try to use it against Meade, even though remember what Meade did at this meeting. He listened, he asked questions, he got a sense for the shape of his command, and they made the decision to stay and fight on July 3. They were not going to leave the battlefield. So that's what came out of this Council of War on July 2nd, a very collaborative event. Such then is the decision. And so this is some of the, this is what was discussed during that war, or during that meeting, excuse me, again, with the bullet point. July 2nd goes into July 3. July 3 becomes the decisive and final day of the battle, and the Union wins. Let's look at Lee and Longstreet. So for day 3, we're going to just top back a little bit to the southern side. And I like this graphic, which is pixelated. It's kind of difficult to see, but I think that this graphic kind of captures the nature of the relationship between Lee and Longstreet. So remember, General Lee is the head of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Southern Army. Longstreet is his trusted lieutenant. Lee would call him his old warhorse, his right-hand guy, his most trusted, especially now with Stonewall gone, his most trusted lieutenant. So the relationship going into Gettysburg, it wasn't, if you're thinking of maybe some of your relationships with people that you've reported to in the past, it was not that at all. Very close personal relationship. Men were friends. Longstreet was one of his best commander, very strategic, also a very cautious man, and you would see that in coming. And Lee was a very daring man. So there was a natural tension between the two. Lee daring, and that's why he was able to get the South to where they were relative to, the ability to potentially win this war. Again, we know what happened, but they didn't know what was happening back then. Lee was far and away the most popular on the South, and he was invincible, but Longstreet was beneath him, a trusted lieutenant who could carry out his orders. So that's the nature of the relationship. They have a very good relationship. But really, beginning on day 1, Longstreet was of the opinion, and he verbalized this to Lee. And so, we talk about our team meetings and do we want dissension in the ranks? What type of pushback do we want? We've dealt with some managers who they don't take our thoughts very well. They don't want to hear them. And so this wasn't, this is really interesting because just briefly, and again, there are books that have been written about it. Jeffrey Wirt has a really good one, General James Longstreet. I like, I'm intrigued by the character of Longstreet for a number of different reasons, both his actions during the war and following the war, when he was in some ways ostracized for the actions at Gettysburg. And he was also, Longstreet was also a close friend of Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. They were pals when they were at West Point together, and Longstreet kept that relationship. So he's an interesting historical figure. But just to return to July 1st and 3rd, if you think about it, Lee wanted to play offense. Lee wanted this to be the knockout blow because he figured if we can beat them here, if we can march on DC or just get them lost, he figured that we can't beat them with resources, but we may be able to. In the election of 1864, they get rid of Lincoln. So Lee is on the offense, thinking this is key. We can win it. Longstreet wants to play defense because Longstreet knows that they can't win a battle of attrition. And Longstreet thinks that if they play defense and make the Union come to them, then they can defeat them. So through all those 3 days of battle, that was the prism through both which Longstreet and Lee were looking at it. So on day 2, Longstreet, Lee again gave not the clearest orders. He would give a vision and he would expect generals to carry it out. Now he gave his vision to Longstreet, and it would not have been wrong for Lee to assume, okay, Longstreet's going to know what I want him to do because he's done it. But Longstreet delayed on day 2. They weren't able to take the high ground. If you've been to Gettysburg, you've probably seen the peach orchard, the wheat field, the round tops, the valley of death, where men were just mowed down on both sides. So off day 2, Longstreet's command is in rough shape. He's waiting for General Pickett to join him on day 3. But on day 3, and if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, and I think that there's so much focus on Pickett's charge in day 3 that it really does do short shrift to the rest of the activities and the folks who died on that field. But there's a lot of focus, obviously, on Pickett's charge on day 3. On day 3, the enemy is across, and Lee said, the enemy is there, I'm going to strike him. That's very much Lee's MO and would continue to be his MO. Longstreet says, that's the sacrifice of my men. Longstreet didn't want to do it. And we go back to E.P. Alexander, kind of an impartial guy. After the war, Alexander wrote, the Union position could never have been successfully assaulted. And it must be admitted that his judgment, meaning Longstreet, in both matters was sound, and he owed it to Lee to be reluctant. So I find that dynamic really fascinating. And you could dig into it relative to boss and subordinate. Lee would listen to Longstreet. He would hear him, but he was not going to follow through on it. Lee got a little bit irritated with Longstreet a couple of times on day 2 and on day 3. It was not his style it was not Lee's style to yell or to castigate. And so Lee would give looks and you would know when Lee was done. So Lee heard him, but he didn't follow through on it. And again, it shows that really kind of the loneliness of the leader, right? Lee had that decision to make. It's easy for us to criticize him. But at the end of the day, it was his. But at the end of the day, he also did not listen to Longstreet, who pretty much had been consistent through those 3 days of battle. But hey, we're tied at this point, and each side knows the next day is going to be pivotal. So from day 3, I am jumping to day 4, which is July 4th. The irony, right? July 4th, 1863. The battle is done. Now, they probably don't know it as well as we do. We know that July 1st through 3rd is the demarcation of that battle. At the time, as you head into July 4th, Meade holds another council of war. So the communication and the collaboration is going throughout the process. Now, Meade's actions here, although he did, pursue the army, they found that the Army in Northern Virginia had evacuated the battlefield, July 4th. They moved back down south. They had that long train of wounded and troops, and they're heading back across the rivers back into Virginia. Both sides are completely decimated at this point after 3 days. So there's a couple actions that Meade took as a leader that would come back to haunt him that we today would probably say, okay, what he did was kind of fair. Number one, he was criticized for not going more aggressively after the Army in Northern Virginia. They did pursue them, but he didn't pursue them full bore. But again, I always try to put myself in Meade's position, looking at the status of my army and what we had been through, and could they have done it? That's for others to decide. And then the other thing that they criticized Meade for, again, was his collaboration with other commanders during this time period. So, the people, those politicians, and I say politicians both in Washington and the politicians in his army, criticized him for both actions. And we find that, the stuff we deal with today in our facilities, the backstabbing, the people who are just unhappy or never going to be happy, the people who with vendettas, it all existed. You might think, okay, you put it aside for the good of the country. You put it aside to win this noble war. You put it aside in advance of this, this most noble of goals. Didn't always exist. So what do we do? Let's look at some Gettysburg takeaways. We're going to end it there for July 4th, but we're going to kind of revisit. But what intrigues me about Gettysburg, again, relative to the facility site. So this is the business version, not the history version. July 1st, we see the importance of clear information and instruction and to know your team. I think Lee needed to take into account a little bit more of who Ewell was and the position Ewell was coming into. July 2nd, the fog of battle, the going back and forth, but reconvene and then reassessing as leaders and depending upon your subordinates to give you the information you need to make clear decisions. On July 3rd, we have those, and on July 2nd, obviously, I'm talking about Meade. On July 3rd, the tale of two styles. You have the consensus of Meade versus the one man of Lee and the loneliness of leadership. Now, Lee knew following Pickett's charge, Lee took personal responsibility, likely never recovered from seeing that because it was a rout, but it shows the loneliness of leadership. And as when you get elevated to a director role or whatever really the role of leadership is, one of the things you quickly learn is that you're alone often in that decision making. We talk about leadership continuity and the importance of leadership continuity. It really played out differently for each side, right? On the Southern side, you had the loss of Stonewall Jackson and Ewell coming in, and that was a loss of continuity that certainly impacted Lee. On the Northern side, you have Hooker leaving on July 28th. And again, Hooker was kind of, I don't want to say clown because that's not a good word, but it's honestly the only thing. Hooker wasn't as valued or esteemed by his colleagues in the North. But you have Meade coming in, who's most definitely, well, people will take their shots at him, most definitely a professional. And he was able to add some continuity at a time when the North was in peril. So it's very interesting to look at how the continuity played out on both sides. And then beyond July 4th, the aftermath, finger pointing, we're going to look a little bit about that now. Interoffice politics was, is, and will always be prevalent. So we look at the Gettysburg postscript. That's the house where Meade held his council of war on July 2nd. That's if you ever look at this picture, you blow it up, you can see the dead horses and the damage. This is following the battle, just decimated. So they did question Meade. In 1864, they put another, I guess Congress has always been doing committees. They always will. But a committee on conduct of the war investigates Meade. The people who didn't like him come out. They are trying to say that Meade could have had a decisive victory at Gettysburg, but he didn't want to fight. And they said part of the reason that they said he did not want to fight was because they criticized him for having those councils of war and saying that he was trying to he didn't make decisions on his own. These councils of war were, and I don't know how they made the leap logically, but these councils of war showed that he didn't want to fight, and he only fought because the councils of war said, let's fight. So Meade was taking barbs, Meade was taking shots all around. And remember, so he's in DC. Meade in 1864 would give over command of the Army of the Potomac to Grant. Grant would come west, but Meade continued to serve Meade would continue to serve Grant. But think about it. Meade is getting called up to DC in the middle of the war because the war's still going on. It's going to go on until 1865, getting called up to Congress to defend himself for a victory that he achieved. Interesting time. Today, his collaboration would be cited as a positive. So as you see at the bottom, the Congressional Investigation failed to yield any decisive results. And so Meade was able to carry on with his career. Lincoln and Angry Letters. This is a really interesting one. Lincoln is an interesting figure. That would be like saying, I like French fries. Sorry, that's kind of an insult to Lincoln, I guess, to say that. But Lincoln, and this is a management practice that I think we would all be well to follow. Lincoln would write letters. Today, we would just take our phone and we'd fire off a text, which actually makes things more difficult because of the communication. But Lincoln wrote a letter. Lincoln was mad at Meade. Lincoln was one of those people who was mad at Meade for not pursuing Lee and smashing that Army of Northern Virginia following Gettysburg. So Lincoln wrote an angry letter expressing that to Meade, and he never sent it. Lincoln would write many letters that he would sleep on for 24 hours, and he would read them the next day, and often he would not send them. But he realized that I got to get that out. So it was his expression Writing the angry letters was that expression of how he felt, and then he slept on it, and then he decided if he would send it. And the next day for Meade, he didn't. So use angry letters. Don't text. It's, we can do another class on communication and instant communication. Today's world makes it so, we make it so difficult on ourselves because we enable instantaneous communication. Be the first on Twitter, be the first here, be the first there. It works against us. Use the Lincoln and the angry letter approach. Gettysburg Address is another one. And we bring this one up only to talk about brevity and written communication. You can see the picture of Lincoln down there in the lower left corner. Lincoln was the second speaker that day. Edward Everett, senator again from Massachusetts, spoke first for 2 hours at Gettysburg. They were dedicating that battlefield. So imagine sitting through a 2-hour address by a blowhard politician from Massachusetts, Eddie Everett. Lincoln comes on. Gettysburg Address is 272 words, 2.5 minutes, brief, powerful, minimalist. I know I I hear a lot from directors and others. Hey, Pete, how do I say this? How do I say that? And it's always, brevity. And I think the Gettysburg Address is a perfect example. Now, we can't all write like Lincoln because Lincoln was probably the best presidential writer ever. But the lesson I always take from the Gettysburg Address when I'm trying to cut something is go brief, go brief, go brief. 272 words, 2.5 minutes. In fact, at the time, people, critics, skewered Lincoln for the speech. Everett was a fan of the speech, even immediately following it. But again, the Gettysburg Address, much like Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg Address did not take on this icon status until a bit later. And this is the other thing from a career perspective, the other thing I take out of Gettysburg. This is a picture of Meade, Meade before the war. So this quote from him, "What a waste of time and energy. He thought he was a failure." This is before the Civil War erupted. This is when he's an engineer building lighthouses, thought he was a failure. And so it's never too late in your career. And when we do career counseling now, I still say this, and especially these days where there's and this is part of the goal and focus of the healthcare facilities network is to fill that pipeline. But these days when we are losing valuable people, if you want to change your career or if you want to go a different path, it's never too late. We see it in Meade. Grant, again, was a failure, was considered, unfortunately, I think history hasn't been kind to him following the war. But anyways, again, that's another topic area. But Grant was a failure before the war. And he came out and became Ulysses S. Grant, the most popular man in the world following that war. It's amazing. If you go back and read some history about that, it's amazing. When I think about Grant following the war, it's almost like he was the Beatles before the Beatles, went on world tours. Grant has a very interesting historical arc. But the point of this little thing is not to talk about Grant or not to talk about Meade, but to tell you it is never too late to change careers. And we see it here in two men who fought at that battle. So this has been a presentation of the Healthcare Facilities Network, History's Facilities Managers. I do appreciate you watching this. I'm just going to stop the share here. And I would encourage you, please, to subscribe to our channel, to like this video. Our goal here at the Healthcare Facilities Network is by programming like this to engage folks, to let people know healthcare facilities management is a tremendous career for you to consider. We have a lot of content coming. I'm working with contributors now. If you want to be a contributor, if you have a show idea, you can see what we're doing. Email me. Our contact information is on our YouTube page. It's on our website at Gosselin-associates.com. So if you'd like to be part of this, please let me know. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you have a great day. I'm Peter Martin, president of Gosselin Martin Associates. As always, thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And remember, give us a like.